Welcome everyone to episode 33 of Somebody Asked Me with Janice Case. I'm of course your host Janice Case, and I am joined today by my wonderful partners here in this conversation, Henri Williams and Melissa Ellis. We're going to take a little bit of a shift this week away from the direct study of Kendi's book and instead have a more general conversation just about some things that are happening in our world in the last few weeks. There's just been so much on this front, and it just makes sense for us to spend the time that way. So we'll be pulling in some of the learning around Kendi. Henri has said a couple of times in our episodes that clearly the point of his book in one part is for us to really be thinking about this in our day-to-day lives, in addition to thinking about it in terms of policy and policymakers, et cetera. And so because so much of this is impacting our daily lives all the time, but certainly right now, especially, we're going to spend the time that way. So with that, we're going to go right ahead and jump into this, Henri. And I know that what I love about starting where we just discussed we're going to start, which is kind of a local, if you will, experience with you, and then we're going to be broadening it to more national experiences. What I love about that is that's the real stuff happening in our day-to-day lives, right? Like I can read about this shooting of this person over here that happened in Columbus or Chicago or wherever, and have one kind of reaction and thinking around it. But what you do and what Melissa has done and what I've tried to do is bring those real experiences, because what's happening in my life today is where I have the most influence. So tell us about this experience you were having with that district.
Well, yeah, good morning, everyone. It's just fascinating to me that, as Janice saying, these things that we read in the book just come to light as you go into, your day-to-day experiences. So for me, I don't know if I've mentioned this, but I moved back to Kendi, Columbia County, and I wanted to reacquaint myself with the local government and the politics. I started going to the school board meetings, and partly because I remember the experience my three older daughters had when they attended that school.
Right.
Let's put it that way. So one of the things I quickly learned going to the school board meetings was, they welcomed your participation or attendance, but they really didn't want to hear from you. And what became kind of clear to me was, well, no, you can't ask questions. They certainly have this dedicated period where, you can get up and address the board, which is kind of typical. I certainly remember that when I was involved with the school board and school district in Albany, New York. But what was different is they had these subcommittees, because the school board can't do everything, or the superintendent can't do everything. So they formed these subcommittees. So I was on the health and safety committee in Albany, which was a citywide committee. We met at all the different schools, so we would rotate around the city. But it was important for there to be a community member or a parent on these committees. And certainly you saw that. And so here I am, and now reacquainting myself, and clearly I'm getting a sense of, even on the subcommittees, you can participate, but you can't ask questions, or you can't say anything, or you can't comment. Right. And so I had a long discussion with the superintendent, because I said to her, I don't know if you intimated this when you started, but there seems to be this, I don't want to say new trend, but this idea of schools doing better and adopting these endeavors become more diverse and equitable and fair and blah, blah, blah. So, of course, the school district, is working on this. And as soon as I see this, I said, well, I want to be involved. I'm a BIPOC. I have experienced history with the school.
Right.
I've done this kind of work. But as I said, talking to superintendent, she made it clear to me, oh, my words.
Right.
That's nice, but you really can't participate in the meeting. So, but anyway, I persevered. And so through the webpage, they have a link where you can request to be included on the Zoom call.
Okay.
So I did all that. So they gave me entrance on the Zoom call. One of the things I've learned on Zoom is unless you're savvy, you can't block me from talking. I just unmute myself.
Okay. Right.
So as the meeting progressed, I put up the hand signal and I raised my hand and I went ahead and I asked my question, which was quickly addressed with, well, we don't really know if you're allowed to participate and talking to me. So they quickly shut me down right here in the meeting.
Wow.
That I cannot talk, cannot ask questions. This meeting was about racial equity or justice in education.
Okay.
Something they wanted. So my question to the committee was, what was the actual intention of this committee? And when all was said and done, what do you want to have as an outcome?
Yes.
Or is this just going to be a committee of discussion?
Exactly.
And because at this point I said, anything I've heard sounds ambiguous to me.
Right.
So they immediately responded with, oh, no, there is no ambiguity. We do have a goal, but I still never heard what that goal was. And then they brought the superintendent in to somehow convey to me clearly that, yeah, you can be on the Zoom call, but you cannot ask questions or make any comments. This gets worse.
Oh, wow.
So
I didn't think that was possible.
I know.
So I'm literally on a Zoom call with a committee that's a group of school teachers, a party school teachers, the superintendent, and a group of school board members. The whole committee is white, except for one school board member who is Asian American. But honestly, in every school board meeting I've attended, that she's attended, I've never heard her speak. So here we are wanting to talk about racial equity and justice in education. And I'm looking at a committee that is comprised of all white people who want to, I guess, and I applaud their spirit.
Sure.
But the other question I had was, well, what brought this about? And what bothered me a little bit was I think they were being disingenuous, because we know this is more or less as I said a little while ago, a pseudo mandate.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
I've been familiar with this school district. As I said, my 3 older kids went to this school. If there was a concern about racial justice and education in that school, they would have addressed this a lot sooner than now.
Of course.
All right, so I found them being a little disingenuous and, oh, we decided it was a great idea to do at this point in time. Okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
And so then, and I know I said there's more to this. So aside from a group of people that did not represent the population you're trying to bring equality to,
Of course.
And I'll own, no one in the meeting owned whether they were LGBTQ plus. So
Okay.
maybe there was
Maybe.
a representative in the meeting, but that certainly wasn't clear to me. So as they went on, they started to talk about this book club that they're doing. So they're reading this book, Not Light, but Fire.
Right.
And so apparently everybody read the first chapter, and there was a video shared amongst this subcommittee of someone, I guess, at Harvard, who talked about their experience of, I guess, finally in their education experience, connecting with a teacher and how important and significant that was.
Right.
And I think we all would agree with that.
Of course.
So this then segues to this teacher talking about this clip and the first chapter in the book and saying, yeah, you know, what really came across to me is you just gotta love kids. You know, you just gotta, you know, if you just love the kid and care about the kid, this is gonna be all right. Oh. And all of a sudden the superintendent chimes in, yeah, that is so right. Yeah, you know, that's kind of what I kind of got when I looked at this. It segues back to the teacher. Yeah, my teachers are, you know, they're reading this book, they're getting that message, they're so excited, they just can't wait to go. And I'm biting my tongue because I can't speak, I can't ask a question. And what I wanted to say at this moment was, I would assure all of you, if I polled your body of teachers in your district, in any district, 90% of them would tell me they love kids. Exactly. That's why they got into teaching. Yep. However, have you ever heard about something called bias? Right. Maybe unconscious bias. That in spite of my love for kids, things tend to happen. Exactly. You know, but I couldn't ask any questions. Wow. So I'm literally listening to this discussion of, oh my goodness, are you really saying that's the pathway and the solution? And then I'm going to end in a moment. They then segue to the consulting group that they're working with. I won't mention their name because this is public at the moment. Yeah. But I, as you know, I do consulting. I'm part of a consulting group. I reached out to my colleagues. I said, you know, are you familiar with them? No. I went to their webpage, and apparently, interesting, they're connected with a professional development program that I actually worked for years ago as a contractor. Okay. So I'm at least familiar with who they work through. I said, all right. And then I looked at their, you know, their goals and their objectives. And, you know, it's about bringing ethnic, you know, racial, ethnic to community and transparency. Sure. And I'm sitting there and I'm saying, okay, if these are the consultants, and this is the goals that they say they're going to bring to the school district they're going to work with, there's clearly a disconnect in what I experienced in that meeting. Exactly. Yeah. So my ending here is I then said, what am I going to do about this? Yeah. And I thought, as a consultant, I always thought it was important to know the landscape that I'm going into. Sure. Because however you're going to bring about what they want you to achieve, you need to really know the true culture of that organization. Yes. Beyond what they want to tell you what the true culture is. Yeah. And so I decided to write to the consultants and to share my experience that I've had with the school district and this meeting. Very good. And basically, without inferring this, but basically saying, I'm kind of confused about your mission
Right.
As I look at your webpage and the experience that I'm having with the school board subcommittee, please help me understand this.
I love it.
Me too.
Henri, that's fantastic. And it's fantastic.
That's what I wanted to ask you.
Well, first off, it's fantastic because for the listeners, just a heads up, Henri doesn't have children in the school district. So this whole story is through the lens of a community member who isn't just getting involved in his local school district because his own kids are there and it will serve them and him, but because he understands the power of public education and the role of our kids' lives and in our community. So there's that. I want to make sure everybody understands that. All the time you're spending and the thinking you're doing around it. And like I said, you're doing it as a committed community member. So interestingly enough, what actually terrifies me about that, a lot of it terrifies me, but the thing that jumps at me is the makeup of that committee, because it's fascinating to me that they're doing this work without parents. It's fascinating that because I'll tell you this, in the role that I work in, Henri, an assumption I was operating off of was that at least most districts understood that when you do this work, you have to have a community stakeholder group, that it can't just be district people. So the fact that in fact, there's still districts out there thinking that they're going to do this work in-house that's terrifying to me. And of course, it's terrifying to me that not only that, but they also don't have any representation from the groups of people for whom they think they're trying to, this work is about, right? So if they don't have any people of color, if they don't have any Latino people, if they don't have any of those things, even if they were school staff, at least having that from a school staff perspective. So it terrifies me to think that districts are out there thinking they can do this work that way. And what I shared with you right before we hopped on is that a lot of districts are doing that, right? A lot of districts, given the climate, especially frankly, since last May when George Floyd was murdered, a lot of districts said, there's a call for systemic racism reform, and we're not immune to that. We have to look at our own system. And for decades, this from your own consulting, districts have been doing equity work, right? And it's always interesting when you say to a superintendent or someone in the district, what does that mean? What does that look like? And it almost always means stand alone over here. Oh, we put somebody in charge of equity, and now they're going to go design some training, and they're going to have a committee, and they're going to, talk, and they're going to do those things. 20 years later, we're not any further because we're not looking at it through a systems lens. So I love that you went to the consultant. I would not have thought about that. It wouldn't have occurred to me. And most parents, so again, parents, listen up. The district put a wall up as high as they could put it in front of him. And so Henri said, okay, let me go to the consultants. And I will say this as a final thought on it, the contextual analysis you're talking about, right? This work can't be done whether with a consultant or not, without a district engaging in a deep contextual analysis to surface what really are the problems, right? What are the things that are happening that can't keep happening? And then further than that, of course, what's the root cause of those, right? And they span so many different things, as you can imagine. And then from there, being able to construct, okay, so what is our vision for then a district or for a moment and time when our district is serving all kids, that all kids do have the opportunity and access to an experience that serves them well and winds up in them all meeting high standards and having all the pathways open to them, right? And then from there, of course, then they go into designing how you get there, right? If this is our context and this is our vision, how do we get there? That's how we have to approach all work. And certainly more important than any other is this idea of how we are ensuring equity across a district. Go ahead, Henri.
Yeah, and as you're talking, I thought about this and I said, as I'm in this meeting and I heard what they wouldn't allow me to do, I said, oh, maybe I'll give them a pass if they at least include a student. Even if it's a token student, they didn't even do that. Yeah. And I'm going to apologize up front, but we were out in the community. Yeah. And a lot of the high schoolers, they work at the local grocery stores. And so I said, let me just check something out. Right. And so I, purposely looked for students, BIPOC students, because I didn't want to offend anyone. And I just said, oh, do you attend, blah, blah, blah school? Yeah, I do. By the way, have you ever heard about this committee or any? Oh no.
Of course not. Of course not. And Henri, I think
Wow.
my only other thought for you, and I'm sure Melissa's got some thoughts. My only other thought for you on this front before we move forward to the rest of this conversation is, I think it would be real, and you've probably already thought about this, in addition to the letter to the consulting group, and by the way, you have to tell me when you get a response from that. I can't wait to hear what they say. But if you haven't already, I would absolutely do whatever you have to do to submit to make a public comment at the next board meeting. Just to say, it's just right, just to request. I was there, I observed, appreciate that opportunity, and realized I'm a little bit concerned that you're trying to do this work without stakeholders and without people of color, and just leave it at that. Like you know, you don't even have to. It just go on record with it, right? So, and they have met their match with you. I love it. I love it. This is the kind of disruption, right? And you're not talking about disruption where you're going in there just, trying to turn it upside down and be confrontational. Just the disruption of asking the right questions and making people think about what they're doing in a different way.
Well, I'm going to use the word agitation. And, I think if you look up the definition of agitation, that's what I'm doing. It's appropriate agitation, respectful agitation.
I like that.
Because if you don't do that, then what changes?
That's exactly right. I'm gonna note that down. I love that expression, appropriate agitation. Melissa, what are you thinking?
The thing that's been sticking in my head since you began the story, Henri, is the difference. There are different types of people in the world. And while I am one that often gets, I get angry. I won't pretend otherwise. I think that's been very clear in our conversations. I get angry. I often feel like, what can we possibly do? Like, it's so overwhelming sometimes. It doesn't feel like there's anything that one person can do to make a difference. And while in the heart of me, I believe that we can all make a difference one at a time, that's a lot easier said than it is done. At least that's how it feels a lot of times. So listening to you this morning, I'm just like, ooh, we can make a difference one at a time, just like that, just by not giving up when the wall is slammed in front of us. Because I can tell you, Henri, that most people, and I'm not sure if I'm one of those people, but most people would have been like, I tried. Like, I don't know what else to do. And I don't think that most of us would have thought to go to the consultants. I just don't think that that's a common thought. So kudos to you for even thinking to do that. Maybe that's because you're a consultant yourself and you have that lens. But I think most people would have been like, I tried, I'm disgusted, I don't know what else to do. So to hear that you went like, okay, that's not gonna stop me, I'm gonna go to the Zoom. Oh, okay, I can't speak at the Zoom, that's not gonna stop me, I'm gonna go to the consultant. Like, that's what we need. That's what we need. We absolutely need that from people, to not let because they're gonna put up walls. Anytime you're dealing with change, there's going to be people who, even if they pretend they're all about the change, are silently throwing up walls because they're not really invested in the change, so they don't care if it actually happens, or they don't want the change because it benefits them as things currently are. So we have to be prepared to go over the wall. We just have to be. And you are living proof of that.
Well, thank you for that. And this has been a week where I really thought a lot about, in an earlier podcast, I mentioned, a difference between a movement and a moment and sacrifice. And I've come to realize that these are sacrifices. I spoke to my daughters who went to this school, and they made it clear to me, you're not going to be liked. There's another thing going on in Albany where there are protests in front of the police station that have eventually evolved to confrontations and the police burning people's property, the whole bit, about respectful policing. And I literally found myself thinking about, how far am I willing to sacrifice myself? Because I was listening to a discussion about the letter in Birmingham, the Martin Luther King letter that he wrote when he was in prison. And I thought to myself, I'm going to speak for me. And am I passionate and involved enough where I'm going to go to a protest and I understand that I may be arrested and that I may, and I actually found myself grappling with that this week. And maybe because I'm in a different situation now, I'm retired. I don't have to worry about what happens to my job tomorrow. I can't afford bail, but I'm really finding myself thinking about, like we're saying, how far are you willing to go, to make a difference? And at times it's going to require a sacrifice of something on your part. And, these aren't easy decisions.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I know I was, Henri, I've grappled with the same thing, especially as protests have ebbed and flowed. And last summer, I really struggled with how far to go, like you said, and I watched, thousands of people on television out there. And we went to one, what I would describe as a peaceful protest. And by that, I mean, it was one of the ones where it's like, you're not marching, you're just in a certain area and you've got your signs and your banners. And we did, there was some, commentary and that kind of thing. But I do think I think each one of us has to determine the best way for us to be a part of the fight, so to speak. Because I got to tell you, yes, you going to a protest, and I understand the power of protest, and I 100% support that. However, if all we're doing is protesting, we're not gonna. It takes we have to take the fight on multiple fronts, and your fight on the front of this school board, for example, has the potential to have significant impact in a way that your one additional body in a protest might not, right? So I think that, don't get me wrong, I think if we can do it all, we do it all. But I think that we all have to be out there, kind of coming to this in the place where we feel like we can have the most impact. And that's going to look different for all of us. That's kind of where I ended up settling my own kind of grappling with it, because I felt guilty. There were days I felt guilty because I wasn't downtown in San Diego protesting. And
we have to think, that's a really great point, Janice, because I think we all tend to, I keep saying it on this podcast because I can't say it enough. We're not a monolith. And that goes for any way, shape, form, or thing that we do. I live in a town where there are no protests. We don't have protests here. Yeah. So that's not going to be the way I try to do this fight. And I think we also have to understand this podcast by itself is part of the fight. Being a part of this is work to me, is me doing the work. And trying to reach other people to share the information and the perspective that I have, the knowledge that I have. For some people, it's social media. For some people, it's school board meetings. For some people, it is getting to know the people in their neighborhood so they can change the perspective. It could be, there is no right or wrong way to try to fix this mess that we didn't create. Like, there's just not. If you're doing anything, you're doing something, and that's important.
Yeah.
You just reminded me, and thank you for that, because, you do have to weigh your options and look at, where can I have the best or the most influence? And you're right, I could certainly protest and, they'll do the TV camera, maybe or maybe not, be part of that 2 days in jail thing.
Sure.
Or can I have a part in significantly affecting policy in a school district, and, maybe, I don't know if they're mutually exclusive or, one is going to affect the other, but I clearly hear what you're saying. And, but what also I just want to, before I forget this thought, is, Melissa, you remind me of one of the themes of this podcast. And it's through maybe some of our discussions or experiences, we provide to people things or information they never would have thought of. And so as an example, when you both said, in this idea with the school, I immediately go to consultant.
Yeah.
Well, you're right. And that was such a seamless thing for me, but that's because of my experience, that if you don't have that experience, you don't think about that. So maybe what we're also doing is offering the people, when you feel like you've hit this point, no, there's another way to think about this, or another avenue.
Exactly right. That's exactly right. And honestly, you said, Henri, you said, I don't know if they're mutually exclusive, right? Going to the school board versus going to a protest, for example. And here's the way I look at it. I think a part of the reason we saw an upward trend in school districts who kind of scrambled and said, oh gosh, we have to do something, right? We have to answer the call, if you will, to being a part of the solution to racial inequities across systems in this country. And again, as I said, from my role, I saw that uptick last summer, and it has continued. With the pandemic, it's kind of been waging a battle about what takes priority, right? But it has continued. And I've had many superintendents say to me, we need to do something right now, because we have to leverage the opportunity where people are more open to it than they've ever been before, right? We have to make some significant system changes in order to get or to shift away from all of the inequities that we have. And I think that they're not mutually exclusive. I think they're complementary, because if we didn't have people protesting, right, by the thousands, districts might not feel the pressure they're feeling. And if we didn't have districts doing the work, if we didn't have people like you coming when districts are starting to do that work, frankly, they'd be doing the wrong work. So I really feel like they're complementary. I think one supports the other, but without them, right? If you only showed up at school board meetings, but people weren't riding in the street, you'd be a one-off that they could ignore, right?
And it's that way across the board if you stop and think about it. And I'll use starting with Colin Kaepernick's protest in sports. So some of us started boycotting the NFL. No change at all. It wasn't until these protests began that you started seeing organizations like the NFL and all the advertising, like, oh my goodness. It's amazing now that when I go to look for a movie on Netflix, there's a whole category set aside just for me, when before I had to scrounge to try to find Black entertainment. And now it's right there, because everybody across the board is feeling the pressure. Employers are feeling the pressure. So yeah, they are not mutually exclusive. They are hand in hand. And that's what I think everybody needs to understand, is that it all needs to be done, every single bit of it. But by doing pieces, we're all pieces of the same puzzle. We're not going to complete the puzzle unless everybody's involved and on board. So it's definitely interlocked, and it's necessary. And I would venture to say, in my personal opinion, of course, you have probably a more direct impact on than a protest, attending a protest versus making substantive change in the way a district that you're a part of is going to handle something. It's reminiscent to me of everybody flocking to vote for the president, but nobody voting in local elections. Yeah. It's the same. So yeah, definitely don't discredit what you're doing at all. And I'll tell you, Henri, if for nothing else, I now know to look for the consultant, because I never would have done that before, ever.
Amen. Yep, that's so true.
Well, and why I thought about that is, as I said, having done that work, if you really want to do it well, you're coming into an organization to create something, a change, and I can tell you many times, you sit with the management and they paint their picture of the organization.
Yep.
And then you go in and you start to meet with people, maybe trying to get a feel for things, and they didn't tell me this, or
Yeah.
I didn't know about that, you know?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And to me, that's your credibility. And are you, as a consulting organization, and I've had this discussion with my colleagues, we won't compromise.
Yeah.
It's not worth it to us to take the money and do what you want that is not in sync with our mission
That's exactly right.
and what we feel you really should be achieving. So we'd rather not take the job.
Yeah.
Or if you're not, or you're, you know, you need to renegotiate what you're hiring us to do.
Right.
But I do know there are consulting firms that they'll take the money and
Yep.
somehow will make that work. And to me, that's about your integrity.
Well, and to your point, it's about your vision and your mission and what are you trying to achieve in the work that you're doing, right? And so, like I said, it's going to be really fascinating to see how this company responds to you, and then we can move forward with the conversation. But it's going to be interesting to see how they respond to you, because how they respond to you is really going to be indicative of, are they a group of people who have some expertise who are just trying to make some money in an area where they have expertise, or are they people who actually have a vision and mission that they intend to, you know, they intend to achieve by partnering with school districts? It's going to be real interesting and very telling how they respond to you.
But, you know, just another quick one.
Yeah.
So, and you know, you made me think about this, Melissa. There is I think, a significant overlap between what we're saying. I was listening to a discussion where, and they're trying to quantify this, you know, and with data that over a 4 or 5 year period, that they've actually seen where there have been Black Lives Matters protests. There's been a decline in some of the police aggression and assaults, sort of looking at a correlation or at least some link between active protesting and the community becoming more aware.
Right.
And, you know, at some point, maybe have an effect, you know, on what actually happens. So I agree, you know, there is probably a benefit of both, you know.
Yep.
Well, and like I said, I think one supports the other. I don't think districts would be doing the work they're doing. I don't think companies would be putting out statements around equity.
They wouldn't.
And we I don't think most of these things would be happening if there weren't protesting, consistent.
They wouldn't.
Across the board protesting, right? Yeah, I mean,
the fact that we've tried for years to get these things and they didn't come to fruition until protesting started. Like, that's just the bottom line. I can't tell you how long we've been asking for more Black representation in entertainment. Tell you, it's been forever. I can't tell you how often we've wanted, you know, just all kinds of things that we didn't see, and that's why also, to some degree, there's distrust behind it also. Are you jumping on the bandwagon? Which is why the work Henri's doing is even more important, because some of these companies are doing bandwagon kind of things. They are doing this stuff just so that they look aware, so that they seem woke, when in fact they're doing it to make $1 or to ease their conscience. And if we don't hold them to actually making the changes that they're talking about, it's wasted. So these districts, if all they're going to do, I mean, like you said, if all you're going to do is talk, then you're looking really good because you're trying. We're really trying. When in fact you're not. So we need people like Henri and others, and you know, those of us who are trying to make change, to actually hold people's feet to the fire, and that's what you're doing. So it's all one big pool of
so I'm gonna bring this into current events. So if you've been, and some overlap here, which is really fascinating to me. So you've been reading, you know, in these Republican-controlled states, they're literally enacting laws about protesting.
Yes, they are.
And how you can literally be arrested or, you know, or have some legal problems just because you're protesting. And, you know, what I find interesting about that, and then, you know, of course, we're seeing the voter suppression and things like that. And it's interesting because in some ways you can look at this a frame of, well, it's just about, you know, racial inequality, and maybe that's how they sell it.
Right.
But think about the big picture here. What they're doing with this voter suppression isn't necessarily always about suppressing the Black vote. It's about the Republicans didn't win.
Right.
Because if you think about what they're doing, that's a wide net. And it goes back to something I've said in earlier podcasts. You know, the pursuit to cause a bias against maybe BIPOC people also takes in a lot of white people too.
Absolutely.
And when you think about these restrictions on protest and voting rights, it wasn't just Black people who had to stand on long lines. It wasn't just Black people who benefited from drop boxes and mail-in, you know. So, folks, you know, we need to also not be fooled by this this racist rhetoric that somehow they want to buy, you know, sell it on that. And actually, it's a bigger picture, folks, going on here that you really need to pay attention to.
No, and that's a common thing. I'm sorry, Janice, go ahead.
No, you go.
Well, I was just saying that that's a really common thing. If you stop and look at it, it has always been the tactic of those in power and white supremacists to convince even the poorest of white people that they are somehow still better off than Black people if they stick with the people in power. Because when you look at the laws and the things that are put into place, they harm poor whites worse sometimes than they do Blacks. But they see themselves, they have been convinced that they are still a couple of ranks above Black people, and then therefore they're not included in the things that affect us. That's, I mean, like there's actual, some of the videos, if you guys remember, some of the videos taken at Trump rallies and Trump, supported movements, and the things that these people were saying, and you're just slapping your head like they cannot be serious. This is them, that like when they talk about welfare and they want to do away with welfare. Whites benefit from welfare more than Blacks, but they don't want to hear that because it then puts them on par, makes them equal, because that is the dividing tactic. It always has been.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's the hierarchy, right, that Kendi talks about throughout the book, right? That so all of this really comes back to creating a hierarchy that only exists because we've socially created it, right? It's a social construct. But because of that hierarchy, it has allowed people with power over centuries to use it in the ways that you're describing, Melissa, to their advantage, right? And a big part of that, and we talked about this a little bit actually for the last couple of episodes. Every time we talk about current events, we come back to his chapter on the body, because it is amazing, and his chapter on culture and ethnicity, all of them really. But it is so when you understand the history the way he outlines it, it becomes so clear about how from the beginning we have been this message has been created and reinforced over and over and over again from every facet. And Melissa, I thought of it first today when you were talking a few minutes ago, and you mentioned fighting to get more Black representation, if you will, in the entertainment industry, right? And I thought to myself, I could see how someone might say, well, I mean, why is that a big deal? You know, like it's entertainment, it's acting, who cares? But when you think in terms of his research around the body, in my mind, it's a really big deal because we need every opportunity to see Blacks in a positive light. And I feel like that doesn't even sound right coming out of my mind. But the fact is, when you understand the messaging and how we have been completely just taught from the moment we're born in this country that the Black body is bad, that the only way to counter that is to ensure constant messaging of the opposite, right?
And when it's reinforced, that message is reinforced through entertainment. When the roles that you see Black people play are those of criminals, or the help, or the servants, or the sidekicks, or the lazy person that doesn't want to work, or the ghetto baby mama, or you know what I mean?
Right.
So it's, representation, and it's interesting, Janice, and of course, no knock to you, because I love you to pieces, you know that. But it's interesting because white people often don't understand why representation is important, because they're represented.
Exactly.
You see yourself everywhere you are, everywhere you look, you see yourself, and you see yourself represented across the board. You see white people cast as criminals, as great people, as doctors, as lawyers, as teachers. We don't get that. We don't see that. So when we do, it's a really big deal, and it has a big impact, and it impacts all the way down to what our children believe is possible for themselves.
Of course.
And it's very interesting. That could be a whole show by itself, on the importance of representation. But because of what you said, especially in this time, that fear of the Black body exists because the Black body is constantly portrayed one way. So if we can portray it a different way, then that definitely helps in getting people to understand that we are more alike than we are different.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, this actually touches a little bit on chapter 10, which we weren't going to talk about,
go ahead,
but
jump in.
the whole idea of whiteness and, how, my words, this construct of looking at everything through that lens, so to speak. And it was interesting because, as like I said, I read the book and I just go back, just to okay, let me, capture some points.
Right.
And I can see how, and he says in this chapter, he comes to this, I hate white people.
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of the response of maybe what someone could have said when I was sharing my story earlier. You hit this wall.
Yeah.
And you're dealing with this group of folks, and you can't seem to get anywhere, or they don't seem to play fair, or things just seem unbalanced and unequal, and there's nothing you can do about it. And then you come to this, I just hate you, and and that's not good either, when you really think about it, that's not the solution. And I think that's what he's trying to convey. That's an absolute that isn't also helpful. And trying to be an anti-racist. But I get it. I really
that goes
do.
back. Yeah. That goes back to what we were talking about a little bit before in the last one, because we can never touch on every single part of this book. This book is so that we can't get everything, but I kind of mentioned that a little bit before in the overcorrection. It's a form of that overcorrecting, because after a while you just get so fed up. Like there's that saying where people say, well, if you're tired of people playing the race card, imagine it being dealt to you every day. If you're tired of people talking about race, it's because you haven't stopped to think about what it feels like to be on the receiving end of racism. And when you're on the receiving end of racism at every turn, and I think that's something most people don't understand. It's not just police brutality. It's also education. It's not just education. It's also entertainment. It's not just entertainment. It's also, housing. It's also employment. When you hit that every single time, and every time you do, there's whiteness attached to it, it's very easy to get to that place. I've absolutely been there. I cannot lie about that. I've absolutely been there and had to do the work to remind myself. And for me, it was the autobiography of Malcolm X, which is why when he spoke of that in this book, it really touched me, because that is what made me think, whoa, now if my hero can readjust his way of thinking, I have to readjust mine. And so I have. And I understand completely that not all white people are this way. Most, I would even venture to say, I don't even think most realize the depths of which racism reach. They think it's just, oh, you don't like Black people. Well, I like Black people, so, it's not that. It's not whether or not you like Black people. It's whether or not this system benefits everyone equitably, and it does not.
Exactly.
Something you said earlier, and this reminds me about inclusion and importance of inclusion. And, I think about that back and forth sometimes. And the only cohort I say will fit into that is white men. Yeah. And the one I sometimes just do not understand is women or white women, because in this discussion, I guarantee any discussion I have, if white women think they've been included, what planet have we been on?
Right.
And yet I'm saying they, and I know that's generalizing to an extent, but there is data to support that white women in some areas have supported some of these ideas that are affirming for them.
Yes. Well, it's not unlike, Henri, you're saying.
And so that's indoctrination. And it just makes me think about the power of indoctrination.
That's it.
In what you were taught.
Yeah. And that's where I was going with that. That it's not unlike what you said just a few minutes ago, that we are constantly being, and I'm going to use a funny word, bamboozled, right, around who benefits and who doesn't from policies, for example, because like you said, especially poor white people, right, they will be harmed as much as Black people from some of the voter suppression things that we see happening right now. But the messaging, right, it's been built in from early on that at least you're better than. And I think that holds true with women, right?
It holds true with, I think it holds true with women, and it holds true with Blacks. And I need the world to understand that. I keep bringing that up, that we as Black people have been just as indoctrinated for some of these racist views. And to bring it to the current day, this week, when Ma'Khia Bryant was shot 4 times in the chest, it was Black people who debated me on whether or not that was excessive. It was Black people who found justification in her shooting. It was Black people who felt like all of a sudden, and the very Black people, I would like to say, who were opposed to police brutality, who have been fighting the fight to say they're excessive, like they need to have less lethal ways of dealing with violent situations. We don't need to shoot first. We need to, de-escalate. All of a sudden, didn't find those things necessary for a 16-year-old girl. And granted, the 16-year-old girl had a knife. Nobody's debating that. But how many times have we seen white assailants with knives, guns, beating cops? We talked about this on the show last week, who come out unscathed, who don't get 4 bullets to the chest. Right. But Black people have also been indoctrinated to accept some of these racist viewpoints and ideas. And so that's what I think we don't pay attention to enough, is how deeply ingrained these ideas and thoughts and policies and laws and patterns go.
Yeah.
Well, when you think about indoctrination, let's put it this way, and as we reflect on the previous 9 chapters, if you lived in America, the script was pretty universal. It wasn't like we're going to indoctrinate this group different. I mean, everybody got indoctrinated. So whether you're Black, white, yellow, green, whatever, we all got that indoctrination of white is better, and then everything else comes along. So I'm not surprised, like we've continually said, no group is a monolithic. No group thinks totally always the same way. And so there'll be curious debates, about any Black experience and whether or not they deserved it or not. That would sound very similar to if you were sitting with a group of white people, because of the very similar indoctrinations we all have had.
Well, I agree with you, Henri, and I'm thinking about a couple of conversations I had this week, Melissa, and especially with Ma'Khia Bryant and the because she, like you said, because she had the knife, right? Like that, it completely, like you had the knife, you deserved it, or they had to do it, or whatever language you want to use, and gently trying to remind people, okay, I hear you, but is that always the case every time the person has the knife?
That's
Is
right.
that always the case? And the answer to that question is no. So what we're
No.
digging into is whether we think that cop should be charged or not, put that aside. Why in that moment did he need to use deadly force?
That's the bigger
Why?
issue.
Like we have to dig into that, because those are the misconceptions, the indoctrination that we have to get to, expose, to begin to change, right? It's not just about whether or not we should charge that cop. It's about why he
It's
dispelled
about the
deadly
system.
force.
That's right.
Right.
That's exactly right.
And so, and then how do we get to that root cause and then change whatever was happening there? And what we're learning, at least through our, our common conversations around Kendi's book, is, in my mind, if I were going to jump to an assumption, my assumption would be, okay, what is that individual cop's thinking, understanding, etc., around Black people? Right? Again, I'm going back to his chapter on the body. And if that's your indoctrination, it doesn't matter what you've been trained to do, right? It doesn't matter. What Kendi helped us understand is, if that's the indoctrination, then every time, and you said this, I think it was last time or a couple episodes, Melissa, ago, that it was, I feared for my life, right?
Every time.
And every time that happens, we have to dig into the why that's behind that. Why did you fear for your life when it was a 16-year-old girl? Why did you fear for your life when it was a 13-year-old boy? What about that situation was different than another situation that deadly force wasn't used? We have to start to dig into that, because what we're going to find is exactly what he reveals to us, which is
Absolutely.
it's so deeply ingrained that we don't even know it's there, right?
So this is where indoctrination is so powerful, because this kind of, as I'm listening, takes me right back to where we start. Oh, you just gotta love the kids. That's all you gotta do.
Yes.
Think about it real quick. But here you have this indoctrination that even spans a police officer who is not white.
Yeah. Oh, exactly. That's my point.
And so,
Yep.
What really comes into question is something we've talked about, is that bias, and when you encounter a person who is not white, and have you been indoctrinated in this profession and in this society, that you have this type of reaction, because, we're talking about this girl with the knife. And I'm not going to get into the details because I'm still looking at the video myself.
Sure. Yeah.
However, we know that there have been white males with assault weapons walking in public, shooting people who got arrested unharmed.
Exactly.
And to me, an assault weapon is a little bit more dangerous than a knife.
Yeah.
And to me, it just goes to, which, like I keep saying, is the bigger issue. It is looking at the police procedures overall.
Right.
What are the de-escalation methods? What are the efforts? Because I'm not seeing them. If you pull up on a scene and within a minute you are firing shots, when there's nobody's been shot, nobody's been stabbed, there's a threat, but no harm has been done, and your instant reaction is to fire, we're not using de-escalation. I don't care who the person is, Black, white, red, you're not using de-escalation tactics. What are the de-escalation tactics? What are the other non-lethal options? Tasers, nightsticks, whatever. Like, what is the procedures? And if there are procedures in place, why are they not being used? And that, to me, is the bigger picture. It's not this one issue. It's not this one case. It is that comparison. It is absolutely that comparison, that in some instances where, like the one we talked about last week, the cop is getting dragged and beat with a hammer, but no shots are fired, not even one. Someone is actually in the process of being harmed, but there's no fear. Where this other situation, there is the potential for harm, and you're so terrified that you shoot 4 bullets into the chest of a child. It is a problem that has to be addressed overall, not situation by situation.
Well, and
so this is part of the George Floyd. This is real quick. The George Floyd legislation that they're trying to pass as we speak, and so there's been this discussion about the whole, and apparently, I guess your Senator Scott is trying to work with Senator Cory Booker to fine tune some of the details. And as I was listening to one of the particulars, I said, oh, this is fascinating. So one of the particulars is it's about bringing police reform, as we know. That's one of the major parts of this bill. And one of the components is accountability. And I believe the George Floyd bill wants to hold police accountable. And Scott is trying to take that out or soften that and reduce accountability of actual policemen, as we saw in this conviction this week, and shift that to the police department. And I thought, oh my goodness, you know, people, please do not be fooled by this. We've already have that. If you look historically at every one of these police shootings, the police departments and the cities have ponied out millions of dollars already.
That's exactly right.
What was going to be different, you know? So it's just another attempt to water down true accountability. But it's just interesting. I think what I've tried to convey in these podcasts to people is listen with a third ear, as somebody has said to me. You know, don't just listen to what they're saying, listen to what they're not saying. What's in between the lines? What's really going on here?
Henri, I love that. And I love that that was actionable, because we're coming up toward the end of our time. So we're starting to kind of get to that point where we talk about what do we want people to think about or to be doing this week. But I love that idea of listening with the third ear, right? Listening to kind of beyond what they're saying to what they're not saying and the implications of it. And I think, Melissa, you're getting exactly to what we're talking about, which is we do have to look at the procedures, right? We have to look at all those things, because what we know is this: if you put in procedures to decrease the possibility of someone being harmed, then that's a step in the right direction. And Henri's right, that some of those things have been put in, but if we put those in, right, what we want is people being trained repeatedly on thinking a little bit differently when they roll up, right, onto a scene. That's what we're looking for. And I'm going to liken it to what we see happening in schools. What we've been watching for the last 5-10 years is a laser focus on the inequity of discipline of Black children in our schools across the country. And so to respond to that, we're doing an analysis of the system and putting things in place where we say, you cannot do the following, right? In California, I think just a year ago, God help me, I can't believe we needed legislation for it, but we did. We finally passed legislation that says you can't suspend a preschooler. We had to have legislation for that, but we did it, right? So now that's not even an option, which means people are forced to look for a different solution. You're talking about the same thing, right? What do you have to put in place so people are forced to look for a different solution?
And not only that, it aids in holding people accountable.
Yes.
If there's no clear, guideline as to how a situation should be handled, and I get that they may not be able to follow the guidelines for every single case, but at least you can go back and look and see, okay, you were supposed to do this. Why was this not done? Right now, there is none of that. So any cop just uses their own judgment. And that's why they get away with the "I was afraid for my life" defense, because there is no real procedure that you're supposed to follow. If de-escalation is a part of the requirement, then if you're not doing that, if you're not taking the steps to de-escalate, or if using non-lethal options is supposed to be done and you're not doing that, we can see that. We can see that, oh, okay, you were supposed to do A, you jumped all the way to D. So we can hold you accountable for not doing what you're supposed to do. We don't have that ability now. And that goes across the board for everything, not just with police, but on my job. If I have a responsibility or to do and it's not made clear to me, then you can't hold me accountable for not doing what you didn't make clear I was supposed to do. So if we truly want accountability, have the policies and procedures. They go hand in hand.
So let's think about kind of whatever your kind of last sentiment for folks this week, and I'll share mine, and then I'll come to Henri and Melissa, and then I'll do our look ahead for next week. And I think mine is, and I had this conversation with a cousin actually earlier this week talking about this in general, but then looking specifically at Ma'Khia Bryant. And what I said to him, because he was of the mindset, he's, you know, generally speaking, you said this, Melissa, earlier, some friends of yours, like very much about police accountability, et cetera. But he looked at that situation and said she had a knife, so therefore, right? And I said to him, and he said, so why all the backlash? Why all that? And I said, because it is so prevalent in this country that a person of color is more likely to die at the hands of police, that every time it happens, we have to dig in. Every time, even if that person was shooting when they got there, maybe we're only going to look into it for 5 minutes in that case, but every time we have to look at it to make sure there's no room for just, oh, that one was fine, keep going, right? And he was great about receiving that and kind of going, oh, okay, that I can understand that there's no harm in digging in and making sure. Okay, got it. So that's what I would encourage. That's my kind of last thought for folks today is, you know, thinking in terms of what you're seeing and sadly there's so much right now, thinking in terms of what we're seeing, and thinking in terms of in your day-to-day life, right? How do you absorb that? How do you understand that? How do you catch yourself just jumping to a conclusion and moving forward, whatever that conclusion is, and moving forward, right? And instead step back from it, and remind yourself that, you know, a part of this really is digging in and understanding root cause. And we don't do that by watching a 2-minute video clip of what happened. We don't do that by listening to the local person say whatever they say. We have to think about that from our own lens. Henri, what do you got?
No, so you made me think about something real quick here. And that discussion you said you had with your cousin.
Yeah.
And I listened to my cousin this week with about the same incident,
Yeah.
you know, and you know, and it seems to be the knife, seems to be the linchpin. And I want to take this back to, again, what I began this whole conversation about. Well, you just gotta love the kids. I would guarantee you, if you dissected that situation, what did he see first? Did he first see a knife or did he see a black body?
Yep.
Did he then see a black body and then a knife?
Right.
Because I think if you sequence it in that way,
Yes.
you come maybe with a different conclusion. Because if he had rolled up and he saw a white person,
right,
and then a knife, I'm going to suppose there may have been a different reaction.
Absolutely.
I'm just going to suppose that.
I think
And Melissa's correct. There are de-escalation techniques that could have been tried. And again, would that have been based on, and they keep talking about, and I heard this even in the trial, you know, police have to make this quick, immediate assessment when they come upon a situation, you know, with George Floyd.
Split-second decision.
Quickly assess the situation to, you know, what he's going to do. So I keep going back to, what is the first thing you see? A black body.
That's it.
That's the first piece of the assessment. And I go back to, as I said in the beginning, what people fail to then factor in is bias.
Yes.
Unconscious bias. So I'm going to say, think about that and listen to things with the third ear. What are they saying? What are they actually saying? Or what is in between the lines that you aren't hearing?
I think,
okay.
Yeah, I think those are, that's so important, Henri, thank you. And it made me just want to come back really quick, Melissa, before I come to you, because I want to make sure people understand that when we say, you know, when a cop rolls up, what's the first thing they see? And if it is the black body, to really reinforce for folks that that is significant. I think it's easy to kind of say, oh, it was a black person. So, but when you understand the history behind that, and the fact that from at the very earliest, at least the 1600s, it's happened much earlier that in history. But you know, when I look at Kendi's references, in this country, we have been given the messaging that the Black body was devilish, that the Black body was, hold on, where is it? Is a fiend, a wild beast, seeking whom he can devour. That the large criminal display of violence among minority groups is significant. The criminality of the Black body has been just completely embedded in us. So when the cop rolls up, God bless them, if that is what they have, not if, since that is what they have, when we're leaving it to that split second assessment, I hate to say it, but that's not, yeah, your training is supposed to help you in those split seconds, but that messaging has been happening since that person was born. And so what's going to prevail? And when we see what's prevailing is that messaging. And so how do we begin to think about that messaging and counter it in our day-to-day lives? Melissa, go ahead. Sorry, I just wanted to bring that in.
No, I'm glad you did. That's a very important point. I have two things I'd like to say. First, I would be absolutely remiss if I did not bring to light the shooting that occurred in our hometown, Janice, of Spotsylvania, Virginia, this past week. A young Black man was shot 10 times by a police officer who had just driven him home. The police officer had given him a ride home. His car broke down. The police officer gave him a ride home, dropped him off. There was an altercation between him and his brother that resulted in him calling 911. From what I could hear from the 911 tape, he did make some threatening statements towards his brother, that he was, going to fight his brother or going to kill his brother, something like that, but requested that an officer come get him because he had no vehicle. The officer came. His name is Isaiah Brown. By the way, I do have to say his name. Isaiah Brown was in the yard holding a phone, the very phone he was on the phone with the 911 operator on at the time of the shooting. The cop got out of the car, and from what I understand, it was a matter of seconds. The cop yelled one time, hands up, and then shot 10 times. He was shot 10 times and is currently in the intensive care in the hospital. That is our hometown of Spotsylvania, Virginia, a town that I am very comfortable saying felt far removed from any kind of such things, because it is a small town and often has a very racist viewpoint. From, if you look at any newspaper comment sections, which is probably the case everywhere you look, but in our hometown, I see it often. They just feel like police are the heroes and we're making a big deal out of it. And now this case sits firmly in their lap. So I just wanted to send my well wishes to Isaiah Brown and my support to his family. I felt like that was necessary to say, since we talk about such cases all the time. The other thing that I wanted to say, as far as my action, it's real simple today. It's be Henri. Be like Henri. Find a way over the freaking wall. Like, that is, Henri, I cannot begin to tell you what an impact you had on me this week from just that. I will not give up. I cannot give up. Even when the wall seems tall or thick or impossible to go around, I will find a way to dig under that sucker. So I would say to everyone listening, hashtag be like Henri.
I love that. I love that so much. I think we go with that. That's fantastic. And I appreciate you bringing that to light, Melissa. I had not even heard about that shooting. So I'm going to go look it up as soon as we hang up. So thank you for that. And it speaks to, there's so much, right? There's so much. And so I know it can be exhausting. And I think that people get to the point where they're like, oh my gosh, haven't we talked about this enough? Oh my gosh, aren't they protesting enough? Oh my gosh. And the answer is, no, not until it stops. That we have,
oh my God, hasn't enough people been killed?
Exactly.
That's the real question.
That's the counter. Yep. Go ahead, Henri.
So, you make me think about, so, we were texting before our podcast, and I said to you, I hate to feel this way or say this way, but I know this isn't going to end. Yeah. And it reminds me, they were interviewing one of the lawyers in the George Floyd incident, and what do you think? And he made this point of, he says, yeah, we have this, but just today, and he rattled off who's been shot and where, and so there's this constant reminder of, yes, there are the George Floyds, and we can say the rest of the names, but there are many others that are on a regular daily basis. And I'm listening to what you just shared, Melissa, you know, and it goes back to what we just said a little while ago. In that quick seconds, when the police officer comes up and he makes that critical assessment, what does he see? Does he see a phone, or does he see a black body?
Yep. And I think, Henri, that's a great place to wrap up, because I think that's a powerful question to be asked. Because if you see the black body first, and I just can't see how that's not the case, given the outcomes or the endings that we have, then that it's as if it predetermines the ending. So we're going to pick up next week. We'll come back to Kendi's book a little bit more directly, to chapter 10. Henri, you brought some of that in for us today, but on white, where he makes the argument for separating the idea of racist power from white people, not kind of lumping it all together, if you will. Hopefully we've given you a lot to think about today. As always, like, subscribe, share, do all the things. The more people who hear this, the better. Tune in next week and we'll get to it.